So today I'm going to share with you an analysis of the shoulder joint during the tennis serve. So for the serve itself, it's the start of every play, and you get two chances to get it into play on the other side of the court over the net. It's the only stroke of the game that the player can completely control. They can dictate the speed they want, the direction, the spin, the timing at which they throw it, things like that. And there's a variety of different types of serves, but the basic mechanical principles behind them all are the same, and their basic movements are the same. The shoulder joint itself is the articulation between the head of the humerus and the glenoid fossa, as you can see in this picture, dictated by the white shading. It's a synovial joint, and within that classification, it's a ball and socket joint, which means that it can move about each axis and in each plane. And one thing to note is that its only attachment to the axial skeleton is via the scapula here. So they often move in conjunction with one another. An example of this is glenohumeral rhythm, where when you raise up your arm past about 110 degrees, your scapula will move with it. There are many other examples of this, but that's just a notable one. Some other structures in there are the articular cartilage, which covers the head of the humerus and the inside of the glenoid fossa, providing a smooth surface for those bones to rotate in the synovial fluid. And then an extension of this articular cartilage is called the glenoid labrum, and it makes the actual socket of the ball and socket joint. Because the head of the humerus is so much larger compared to the shallow glenoid fossa, this labrum helps to increase the contact area with the head of the humerus, and it also helps to stabilize this joint and again make that ball and socket. Some ligaments, there's lots of ligaments around the shoulder. I just wanted to point out one called the capsular ligament, which is the one that kind of surrounds the head of the humerus up there and connects to the scapula. It will generate stabilizing tensions across the joint, but one thing to note is that it is relatively loose, so that helps to maintain the range of motion in the shoulder, but then it's only stable around the extremes of motion. So what the shoulder has is it also has muscles that help to stabilize the joint. So that's why I put the rotator cuff in here, because it's known for stabilizing the shoulder, but it can also help maintain joint space, which can help maintain that articular cartilage so they don't start to rub on each other. The rotator cuff does have its own actions, but I wanted to put it in here talking about stabilization of the shoulder and those ranges of motion. The muscles around the shoulder, to start off, the pec major has upper and lower fibers, which is good to note because those upper and lower fibers have different lines of actions, which means that they can produce different actions, which I'll talk about later. So that's a good thing to note now. There's also the subscapularis, coracobrachialis, and the biceps brachii. I wrote kind of here because it will produce weak actions. It does cross the shoulder joint, but it's more of a stabilizer than a muscle that will actually produce torques and things like that. Posterior muscles, the lats, teres major, teres minor, infraspinatus, and the triceps brachii, only the long head crosses that joint. Then superiorly, the deltoid, anterior, middle, and posterior fibers, again, are very important to note. And then the supraspinatus. Actions, abduction and adduction, as you can see in that picture, raising your arm up and down. Flexion and extension, again, raising it down, up and down, but in front of you. Horizontal abduction and adduction is crossing your body. And then external and internal rotation is, as you can see in that picture, rotating your shoulder about that axis. And I wanted to show you this video of the tennis serve itself, just so before I go into the phases, you can see what's kind of happening. You can see that shoulder starting to move and come back and then come forward. So if you just keep that in mind while I talk about the phases, I think that'll help keep you oriented. So for the phase of the serve itself, there are four main ones. Sometimes there's 3. Some people say there's 8. but these 4 main ones are seen across the board. And if there's 8, they're usually subphases and things like that. But these are the 4 main ones that are all defined the same, even if they go by different names. So they are the preparation phase, as you can see in Figure A, the cocking phase in Figure B, acceleration in Figure C, and the follow-through in Figure D. So also kind of keeping this picture in mind to help as I explain them. Phase 1 is from the start of the service to ball release. And the goal of this is to align your body to most efficiently set up your legs and torso to generate force throughout your shoulder. So you need this alignment to more effectively do so. And as you can see in this picture, the one on the left is the very end of the preparation phase. And you can see how his body is aligned. The movements here are abduction and early external rotation, so that very first part of external rotation. And across different sources, some note that there is horizontal extension, and another one noted that there is extension. I just noted it here because that will dictate what muscles are also activated. The cocking phase begins at ball release and will go ball release from the non-dominant hand and will go until maximal external rotation of the dominant hand. And the goal here is to ultimately store potential energy that will be used in the next phase. The shoulder movements here are abduction and external rotation for sure. And then the debated ones again are horizontal extension as a continuation of the preparation phase. And then flexion was a different one that I only saw once, but I noted it again. And then at the end of this phase, it's good to note that your arm will be abducted to approximately 101 degrees and externally rotated to approximately 172 degrees, which is pretty far. And then the acceleration phase, from the beginning of internal rotation to impact of the ball. So the goal here is to convert that potential energy to kinetic energy to create velocity and accelerate that arm forward. The movements here are pretty universal across the board. Abduction and internal rotation. Someone thought there was some slight flexion, so I put it in there. And again, you want to produce a lot of velocity in this phase. So the peak angular velocity that can be produced is about 2,500 degrees per second. And in professional tennis players, this phase lasts 1/100th of a second. That's just how fast they're moving. And then the fourth phase, deceleration, goes from impact to the completion of the serve. Its movements are adduction and internal rotation, and again, maybe some flexion from that one source. And one thing I wanted to note here, and I'll also say this again during the muscles, you need high eccentric muscular forces to dissipate the acceleration and the forces from the acceleration phase, so that you can be ready for the next play. And then this chart at the very bottom is a good way to see how the humerothoracic joint angles change. And one that I just wanted to note are these internal and external rotations that are very important for the serve. So between the end of early cocking and the maximum external rotation, there's a very large external rotation in a short amount of time. And then again, upon impact and to follow through, there's a very large internal rotation in a very short period of time. So before I talk about muscle activations, I just wanted to say, when I was looking up sources, there was a lot of contradiction. So I tried to add everything and explain why they gave me these numbers to the best of my ability. So phase 1, preparation. Across the board, muscle activity is relatively low, and most people agreed with that. The activation range from 5 to 18%, which is defined as low. The middle deltoid and the supraspinatus are significant because they are on the higher end of this, and they are noted as being the agonist of the initial abduction of the shoulder here. Someone noted that the lats were also pretty highly activated, but they didn't explain the activity that they were doing. So I wanted to note it because it is pretty high, but they didn't explain much farther. And then the PEC major is interesting here because it does have low activation. But one study noted that it only had 5% activation, and another one said that it had 19%, which is a pretty wide range. But then what I found was the 19% defined where they placed the EMG electrodes. So I tried to draw it on this picture, approximately where they placed it, and you can see that those are in the lower fibers of the PEC major. So I don't know this for sure, but I thought possibly the 5% placed it in the upper fibers, and then those would produce different lines of actions and do different things, which could possibly explain that difference in activation range. And then other muscles that are activated, subscap, infraspinatus, anterior deltoid, and posterior deltoid, still relatively low, so they didn't define the actions that are happening. Cocking phase, the main part of this phase is increasing external rotation. So what happens at the end of this phase is that the external rotators have to be slowed by the eccentric contraction of the internal rotators. So there's a lot of muscle activity going on here. To start, the infraspinatus is an agonist for external rotation, mainly during the first half, but you also see it variably activated in the latter half from a different source. And again, someone says it stabilizes the shoulder girdle as being part of that rotator cuff, but it is also an agonist for external rotation. Next, the middle deltoid. Relatively low activation, and that's because someone took into account that the trunk is also laterally flexing, which is assisting in that abduction that would be happening. The anterior deltoid is eccentrically controlling the arm as it horizontally abducts and externally rotates. So that's why it's more activated in the latter half as it continues to horizontally abduct. And then what also happens is this muscle will store elastic energy that will be utilized in the next acceleration phase. Then the posterior deltoid is also turned on. It's turned off as the external rotation begins to slow down. And then the supraspinatus, kind of cool thing, it works as a force couple with the deltoid to control external rotation. And again, still provides stabilization, but it is, during that abduction, an agonist. That's why it's so high. Acceleration phase, main muscles, the PEC major, lats, and subscap are all agonists for internal rotation. And as you can see, PEC major 79 to possibly 115%, little variation there. Lats 50% and subscap 113% really provide that fast internal rotation that you need. The anterior deltoid is, again, it's going to now be an agonist of internal rotation. It has a very strong contraction in the beginning, and then its mean value is about 40, so not as strong as the other ones, but it's still working there. The middle deltoid is only at 14%, and that's because at impact, like in this picture on the right, your arm is already abducted to its fullest extent, and it's about to adduct, so it doesn't have to be activated. The supraspinatus and the infraspinatus are active, but it's noted that they mostly stabilize the shoulder. And then the last phase, remember that you need very high eccentric muscular forces to help dissipate that acceleration. So directly after impact, the infraspinatus and the teres minor are going to eccentrically contract to oppose that internal rotation. And then as that internal rotation slows, they start to deactivate. And then the supraspinatus and the infraspinatus, again, noted as shoulder stabilizers. The subscap, PEC major, and lats, because this phase is just a continuation of the acceleration phase, those are still going to be activated, but they're starting to decrease their activation. And then the posterior and middle deltoid are antagonists to oppose the strong adduction and internal rotation that has been happening. And that is it. Thank you.